Matthew chapter 12, and reading verses 9 to 14. Now, just while you're finding that, I said last week that we were starting a new series to do with, to go through Lent, this period as we lead up to Easter. And that the series was based basically on the church statement that we have, that kind of strap line of serving Christ, sharing faith, shaping lives, that we plaster everywhere. But I wanted to actually kind of do it on alternate weeks, and we kind of fall into the alternate one this week. And so this is the odd one because the next alternate week will be Mother's Day, so it's good to be able to do something specifically as a family service there. Now the following one will be Palm Sunday, and I thought, I so often preach in series throughout Lent on a Lent theme that actually when it comes to Palm Sunday, we never actually really do anything about Palm Sunday. We never talk about it. We never look into it. And so I thought that perhaps it's about time we revisited and actually had a look at the events of Palm Sunday and the meaning there for us. So we're going to do that. Today is the slightly odd one out because there are no pegs to hang anything on, apart from the fact that we have got an important members' meeting afterwards. And so my thoughts have been turning towards that, and I don't want to talk too directly into that, but just some thoughts to help us as we start to think about some of those important issues and what that might mean for us as a church. So today I want to look at what I've called the impossible possibilities. The impossible possibilities. Now that is a nonsense in itself, because if something is impossible, there are no possibilities. That is, unless Christ is involved. And then the impossible becomes possible. So Matthew chapter 12 and verses 9 to 14. Jesus has just got himself into a bit of trouble. He's been out walking with his disciples. It's the Sabbath, and his disciples took a few grains of corn that were growing in the field and helped themselves to it. Now you might think that the charge might be stealing. No, it's not stealing. The charge is actually that you've just done some work on the Sabbath. That's the actual charge. That's what the teachers of the law were worried about, the Pharisees. In actual fact, it's not stealing anyway under the old law, because you were allowed to do that as you went along. Don't try going today and digging up a potato in some farmer's field, though, will you? Because they don't like it. But, in those days, that was acceptable, that you could just go along the edge and just strip off a bit of corn or whatever. However, the Pharisees were so rigid in their understanding of the law, and they had made up things about the law, and Jesus actually didn't agree with them and showed them that their idea of keeping the Sabbath was a complete nonsense. And when somebody is made to look, so tiny, when they thought they were so big, as Jesus did with the Pharisees, they tend to get a little bit upset. They've now got a grudge against Jesus, and they're looking for a way to trap him. Having gone through that corn incident in the field, we pick it up in verse 9. Going on from that place, Jesus went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other one. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Don't you just get so frustrated with those super spiritual people who tell you the reason you're not receiving blessing is that you have no faith? You know, we all love to hear that, don't we? We all know, of course, that we are supposed to have faith, and that the more that we have faith, the more that appears to be achieved. I say appears to be because it's not what we're doing at all. Actually, it's what God does through us. But Jesus said, you know, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can go and tell this mountain to uproot itself and plant itself in the sea. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't seen too many people with that kind of faith, or at least if they have, they've not actually done that particular exercise of faith. But the faith to move mountains, as we sometimes summarize it as, is huge faith, is it not? How many of us, I wonder, if we literally saw a mountain that needed to be moved for some reason, say, I believe that can, and you really do believe without doubting that it's going to finish up somewhere else? It's a big ask, isn't it? What Jesus was saying was not so much that if you have faith that's tiny, you can do this, which would, of course, make us all feel a bit inadequate, wouldn't it? But the point is that the mustard seed is the small seed that grew into a huge plant. And Jesus is saying with faith, it starts off small, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until you see greater things happening because your faith is that much bigger. Now, we can't take anything away from that. That stands as it is. That the greater our faith is, the more that we will be able to trust the Lord and to see him at work in our lives and in the situations around us. And maybe then, if we have the faith, that we then see the impossible possibilities. That actually it's then that the things that seem totally beyond us begin to happen. And you've heard, no doubt, over perhaps a long period of time, dozens and dozens of examples, sermons, little pep talks almost, on if you only have a bit more faith. The thing is that in this story, there is no evidence of faith in the healing of the man with the shriveled hand. Stretch out your hand was the instruction Jesus gave in verse 13 to the man. He's sitting there in the synagogue. He's got this shriveled up hand. You've probably seen people just like it today. The hand and the arm all kind of bent up and they can't move it. It's paralyzed. Probably his fist clenched. Can't do a lot with it. And Jesus simply gives the instruction, stretch out your hand. He doesn't say to the man, man, do you have faith that I can heal you? The only ones who had faith, it seems to me, quite clearly that Jesus could heal were the ones who were actually trying to trap Jesus. As Jesus went into the synagogue, there the Pharisees have been following him out of the fields, watching his every move. They've come into the synagogue too. They're sitting there, and there's a man with a shriveled hand, and straight away they say, you know what, he's going to go and heal him. And it's the Sabbath. They're the ones who had faith, the ones who are actually against him. We know this Jesus can heal this man. Now, it's not very often, is it, that you say the unbelievers have faith, but these are the ones who didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. They didn't believe that he was the Messiah. They didn't believe that he was sent from God in any shape or form And yet they're the ones who did believe that he had the power to heal. But they weren't interested in the man with the shriveled hand. They weren't interested that this man, this might be the very day on which his life is completely turned around and changed forever. They weren't worried about that. What they were worried about was that Jesus might do something that constitutes work on the Sabbath. And I love the way that, once again, having already made them look really silly as he was out in the fields, Jesus makes these Pharisees look completely stupid again. He says, suppose one of you's got an animal, the animal falls into the ditch, it happens to be the Sabbath. Are you going to leave it there on the Sabbath? The answer is no. There was provision within the law that said you could lift your animal out of a well or whatever that it got stuck in. That's perfectly okay. And Jesus then hits the nail on the head. Do you not think that a human being is far more valuable than an animal? Do you not think that God cares far more about this man than he does about a sheep that's fallen into a ditch? Of course he does. This man has been made in the image of God. A sheep was never made in the image of God. This man is the subject of the affections of the living God. That's why Jesus came. But sheep were sacrificed. 250,000 in Jesus' time, every Passover in Jerusalem. It's not they weren't valueless, but the man was priceless. Jesus came to die once and once only, that he might be saved, that you might be saved, that anybody who trusts and believes in Jesus might be saved. For we're far more valuable than any creature that God has made. When God goes through that creation process as recorded back in Genesis, we find he goes through everything. And finally, he comes to the pinnacle of his creation and he creates man. Man has been separated out, head and shoulders and a bit more above everything else in creation. And no matter how many times scientists want to tell us that we're actually no different to the animals around us, we've just developed a bit further and we've become a little bit more intelligent than they have and all the rest of it. Complete nonsense. You were created by God in his image for one set purpose, and that is to give glory and praise to him. And yet we have sitting here a man in front of Jesus and in front of all the watching eyes around the synagogue. And in their synagogues, the seating was kind of arranged around the edges, and the centre became like an open space where all the activity took place. So you can imagine that now you've got people sitting on all four sides looking inwards, and there in the centre is all the things that are happening. The man is probably sitting there in full view right at the front. Jesus has walked in, and he can see the man too. And all the eyes are now fixed from every direction watching him. But the man himself has not been approached. He's not been asked, do you want to get well? Jesus did that sometimes to people. Do you want to be healed? The man did not come to Jesus and say, Jesus, please heal me. Jesus walked in and found him. We don't even know if this man knew who Jesus was, though I suspect he probably did. But we're not told that he actually knew who he was. We're not told that the man was getting excited when he saw Jesus come in. Fancy that. Here I am sitting in the synagogue at just the very time when Jesus, this great healer, has walked through the door. We don't see that. And the excitement, as we do perhaps with the men who started pulling the tiles off the roof and lowering the lame man down through into the crowd in the house below for Jesus to heal. There's none of that. none of pushing him forward so that Jesus might see him. No. It's the unbelievers, those who didn't have any faith in Jesus to who he really was, but who knew and had no doubts about the power that he had to heal. They're the only ones who are actually about to bring this about. They're looking at it and they start to question Jesus. Before you even think about doing anything, they're saying, in effect, is it right to do work on the Sabbath? Is it right to heal somebody? Isn't that work? The problem with that is that Jesus didn't actually do any work at all, unless you count some words of instruction. He didn't quite literally lift a finger. He did nothing. Sometimes when Jesus healed, we find that he did things. He made mud, put it into a blind man's eyes. Now go, wash out your eyes. No, none of that. Sometimes Jesus touched somebody. No, none of that. Sometimes Jesus heard of sick people and he went to them. He would have walked more than the Sabbath day's walk to get them. No, he didn't do that either. There is no possibility that Jesus was about to do any work, and yet Jesus says this: it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Just as a little aside here, and I don't want to get too sidetracked, but it seems to me that that very comment speaks something into an issue that sometimes raises its head within Christian circles. The whole idea of should we be working on Sundays. Sunday is not the Sabbath as the Jews had it. Their Sabbath is the Saturday. But it is the day that we've set aside to be holy to the Lord. It is the day of resurrection. It's a very special day for us. And so we come together on this day. And every now and again you'll have somebody who's objecting to doing work on the Sabbath. And I must admit, I have a great sympathy with anyone who says, I'd rather not be working on Sundays, but I'd rather be in church. But very often, I think that there are necessary situations in which people need to work, particularly those in the medical profession. Jesus said, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And therefore, surely it is right and lawful, if you want to put it that way, that if there is some good that we can do to somebody who's in need, and it just happens to be a Sunday, that the Lord is not saying you shouldn't be working, but the Lord is saying it is right to do good on the Sabbath. So let's not get too hung up, too legalistic on those kind of arguments. It is good or right to do good on the Sabbath. But that's an aside. Let's get back to the main point. Jesus looks at the man. The man says he's still not asked Jesus to do anything at all. I'm not sure he even realised what was about to happen. He probably was not in the field when the Pharisees tried to catch out Jesus and his disciples over the corn. So he's probably completely unawares of what is going to happen next. I would suggest that inside the synagogue there were probably a number of people who had something wrong with them. But this man was very visibly paralyzed. Very visibly so. And I think probably sitting right at the front where everyone could see him. When Jesus gives the instruction, all he's asking for is obedience, not faith. Now, I know you might say, in order to act in obedience, you have to have faith. Well, maybe you could argue there's some truth in that. But there is also truth that you can act in obedience with absolutely no faith whatsoever. You can be asked to do something, instructed to do something, and not believe that it would do any good whatsoever, and yet you still do it. Jesus and his disciples were out in the boat, and Jesus says to his disciples, "Let down your net." "Master, we've worked hard all night and have caught nothing. But because you say so, we will let down the nets." I'm not sure how much faith was in Peter's heart at the time when he said that. I know we often pick it out and say, look at the faith of Peter. He was prepared to let down the nets believing that he'd get a catch. I'm not sure there was much faith there at all. "Master, we worked hard all night. There's nothing there. I'm an experienced fisherman. I've been out there all night long. I haven't caught anything. Do you really think that we're going to catch anything now? But because you say so, I'll do it anyway." And of course, his obedience stroke faith was rewarded. But this man's in a different situation. We're still seeing no real signs of faith. Jesus has just walked in. He's having an argument with the teachers of the law. Then he turns to the man and says, "Let me bring you into this. Stretch out your hand." I love the fact the man doesn't protest. "Are you mocking me? You know I can't do that." But there's also something else that he doesn't do. He has a paralyzed hand. Now, okay, visualize this for a moment. The man is paralyzed, okay? He's probably got a clenched fist. His arm is probably all locked in to his body. That's very often how they are, yeah? You've seen people like that. Jesus says, stretch out his hand. What would you do? Would you be tempted to do that? Put your good hand out? I might be. Particularly if I didn't actually think that it was possible anything could happen. But Jesus doesn't have to say, stretch out your bad hand. Just stretch out your hand. And it is the bad hand that he stretches out. And we're told that as he does it, it becomes as good as his other hand as well. That there is nothing wrong, it seems, because he has been completely and utterly healed. If you like, that might start to point towards faith. Maybe it was the very fact that Jesus perhaps indicated which hand it was that he wanted him to stretch out. I don't know. We weren't there. We didn't see it. We're not told. But I find it interesting to note that he does at least try to do the thing that seems to be impossible, rather than taking the easy option and stretching out the hand that is good. You might say, but Jesus was in the context of healing. Sure enough, and maybe the man had picked up on that enough. Maybe he did suddenly realize, maybe it dawned on him at that very point that Jesus is about to heal. The one thing that I do note, though, is not only does the man have to exercise no faith whatsoever, it's obedience, but secondly, he has nothing to lose. He has absolutely nothing to lose. Suppose that he had tried to stretch out that arm that was paralyzed and nothing happened. That the signals from the brain to the hand didn't work, that there was no movement whatsoever. He could have just said to Jesus, it's not happening. It's not moving. What's he lost? Nothing at all. What's he gained? Everything. By acting in obedience to Jesus, no matter how impossible it seemed the request was, the man needed no faith whatsoever, just obedience. And secondly, he had absolutely nothing to lose and everything to gain. And when we act in obedience to the Lord Jesus, very often there is nothing to lose and everything to gain. I know that's not always the case. Sometimes there is apparently an awful lot to lose. But there is one thing that I've discovered over the years, and that is that when we do act in obedience to the Lord, even if it seems that we're losing something, we gain so much more back. So Jesus said of his followers, when you come and follow me, you'll lose so much. Friends, relations. They'll reject you. You're going to lose perhaps your livelihood. You're going to lose so many things by coming to follow me, but you will gain so much more in brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers, in homes, and in everything that you need. That's the promise that Jesus gave. There's nothing to lose and everything to gain. But look, there's a third thing I want you to notice about this. In acting in obedience to Jesus, Jesus took the heat. The fire was on him, but the man received the blessing. You see, after Jesus tells the man to stretch out his hand, and he discovers that both of his hands are now equal, that they're perfectly okay, the paralysis has completely gone, he has received everything. Just through an act of obedience, he's received everything. And now we discover that the Pharisees don't turn on the man and say, "How dare you stretch out your hand? Now you've done the work on the Sabbath." Because let's face it, he's the only one who's really done anything. Jesus said something, he's the only one who's done anything. But they don't turn to him. Instead, we read that they turned on Jesus and they looked for a way to trap him and to kill him. They wanted to get rid of him. Jesus took the heat. And when we walk in obedience and we act in obedience, we find that even if our faith is virtually non-existent, just to be able to step out in obedience will be rewarded. That we have nothing to lose and everything to gain by walking in obedience to Jesus. And even if we do lose something, he always replaces it with so much more. And thirdly, as the result of anything that happens, we are not responsible. The man was not responsible for his own healing. The man did not come to Jesus begging for healing. The man did not try to gain his own healing. He just simply acted in obedience. We are not responsible for the blessing that the Lord pours out. Therefore, he takes the heat, not us. And there will be a lot of angry people around when we start to see the good things happening, when we see the blessing of the Lord being poured out on us. There will be a lot of jealous people. There will be a lot of people with sour grapes. There will be a lot of people who just don't like us because we walk in obedience to the Lord. That's not our problem. Their issue is not with us. It's with the one who works through us. It's with him. They have to take their argument up with him. There were a couple of occasions, when it didn't work like that. A healing was performed by Jesus, and the Pharisees turn on the one who was healed. Famously, of course, the man who was dragged before the city officials, the religious leaders, and asked, "How is it that you're healed? You've been lame for 38 years. How come now you're healed?" Another one. "I don't know how I was healed. I was blind, but now I see." It was Jesus, and he directly points them back to Jesus and says, you better go and talk to him. And even when the authorities started to put the heat onto the person who was healed, it's interesting that Jesus came to the rescue, that he steps in, he defends, and he says, "It's not their problem, it's mine. If you've got a gripe, you take it up with me." And he still does the same thing. He doesn't do it in a physical sense. He doesn't sort of turn up suddenly in a body and start saying, "Excuse me, that was my instruction. They were following me. They were doing what I asked them to do. And as a result, this was my blessing." He doesn't do that. But I'll tell you how he does do it. He does it very often, very subtly, working inside the hearts of the unbeliever. There's that conviction that goes on inside of them. And there are numerous testimonies of people who have been so set and dead against Christians and believers because of what they stand for and everything that they do when they walk in obedience to the Lord. And as a result of it, so many have said that they actually burned inside with an anger, yes, but their anger was not so much towards the people, though often sometimes they vent it that way, but it's towards God. But he deals with that anger. And as a result of that, he's brought many to faith as well. Now, that's not an absolute rule. It doesn't always work like that. There will be some people who go all the way to the grave and will still be angry with God. But we still got to walk in obedience. The one thing that we can say in all of this is that the Lord does not work in one set pattern. He has many ways in which he works and operates. But there are some principles here that are generally speaking true. Just to recap, obedience is more important than faith. That might come as a surprise, but obedience is more important than faith. The faith will come. It will grow. The more you walk in obedience, the more faith you have. Ask yourself this question. If Jesus had gone back to that same man who'd had the paralyzed arm, gone back to him a second time and asked him to do something again that seemed impossible, do you think the man might have actually had some faith this time? Because I do. Having seen the Lord already at work in his life and see the difference he makes, his faith begins to grow. And the same is with us. The more we walk in obedience, the more we see the Lord's hand at work, the more our faith will grow. We have nothing to lose by walking in obedience to the Lord, and absolutely everything to gain. And whatever the result, it is the blessing of the Lord that he pours out. It's not our responsibility, but he takes the full responsibility. He takes the heat for his own actions. It's not you. So what are we waiting for? As individuals, as a whole church, what are we waiting for? There may be impossible things, apparently impossible things, that lie ahead for you as an individual. Maybe as we look for the future with the church, we might look and say, where next? How do we move forward? The point is that even with impossible things, when Jesus is in it, they become possible too. Just going to ask you to bow your heads for a moment. It's good for these things to be personal. It's easy to make them corporate, applying them to the whole body of the church. But sometimes a bit more challenging to make it a personal thing. But I wonder if there are things that you as an individual are facing at the moment that you're looking at and saying, it seems impossible. Ask yourself this question. What is the Lord saying to you in that situation? To do something that he's not saying and pretend that that's faith is actually foolishness. But when the Lord gives an instruction, no matter how unrealistic it seems, no matter how little faith we have, when you walk in obedience, you will see the power of God at work.